In these last 4 months of pandemic and shutdown and reopening, has there been a moment when you've asked yourself, is American democracy up to this challenge? You're not alone. We are bombarded with news comparing the US response to the pandemic to other countries, and too often it seems American democracy is faltering. Back in March, a coworker of mine, a Chinese citizen with a visa to work in the United States, told me she was going home early because she thought she'd be safer in China. She said she just thought the Chinese government would deal with this pandemic better than the US. Later, she sent me a care package from China with 500 medical-grade face masks that I couldn't get here in Chicago. Ouch. That is a care package with a bucket full of national shame mixed in. And I found myself looking at those 500 masks and thinking, was she right? These can seem like dark times for democracy, but the story isn't over. I'm here to talk about why we should have some faith in our form of government. The crisis we face today, democracy versus the pandemic, is a unique one, but it's also the latest chapter in a larger story. That story began on November 9th, 1989. I remember that day. Matter of fact, it's my first memory of politics. I was a little boy. There was a commotion in the living room. I went to see what was going on and found my parents laughing and dancing around the television because some wall in Germany had fallen down, the Berlin Wall they called it. I remember thinking, what in the world could make adults this excited? But that day, America's political system passed one of history's great tests. Ideas are tested by events. Scientists test hypotheses with experiments. Political ideas are tested by whether the countries that champion them flourish. Do they project strength abroad? Do they enable good lives for their citizens at home? Do they win battles? Do they manage crises? Ideas and events move through history together. The day the Berlin Wall fell, American ideas of democracy and free markets triumphed over the ideology of communism. That triumph helped propel forward a wave of democratization throughout the world. In the mid-70s, fewer than a third of the world's countries were democracies. By the early 2000s, most of them were. It was a time of utmost optimism about the American system of government. At its height, it seemed as though the very history of political competition and change itself had ended. American-style government, liberal democracy with free markets, was the last form of government there could ever be. And then the lights went out. The wave of democracy stalled. The world began a democracy recession. A key player here was China. China became a communist dictatorship in 1949, and for the next 3 decades, it was one of the capitals of human misery on earth. But then China began an astonishing rise. I remember backpacking across China with a buddy in 2004. Everywhere we went, the skyline was filled with tower cranes building skyscrapers. It seemed like the whole country was under construction. It was electrifying, not to mention noisy. There was pride too. We took a bus into the mountains, and on the bus was a little boy who wanted to practice his English. He asked me where I was from. I said, America. He said, America. You are stronger than us, for now. My jaw dropped. How often do you hear nationalism from a tween? But incredible as it sounds, that's what he said. With China's rise has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. As fellow human beings, that's something we should all celebrate. But on the level of political ideas, China's rise is troubling because the government delivered prosperity and rose to superpower status while rejecting democracy and freedom. The obvious comparison is to India. India is a democracy, but India has stayed relatively poor. And here in the United States, democracy's stronghold, many of us feel our government was floundering for years before this pandemic hit. So here I stand, telling the story of democracy over the last 30 years, about the same age now as my parents when I saw them dancing around the living room, but they got to witness American democracy go from night to day. I've had to watch it. My generation has felt it go from day to night. This pandemic begins the next chapter of democracy's story. It started out as a medical crisis. It has become a test of our form of government. Again, ideas are tested by events. This pandemic is a challenge confronting all countries. And of course, our shared humanity is more important than political ideologies at a time like this. But precisely because it confronts all countries, it inevitably tests the political ideas on which those countries are based. It's like a stress test of all the governments of the world. Above all, this pandemic extends the pre-existing civilizational competition between China and the United States. They are the world's wealthiest and mightiest countries, and along with India, the most populous. They are the standard bearers for democracy and authoritarianism. Of course, there's more to democracy than the United States. Germany, Australia, South Korea, they're all democracies, and they're all dealing with the pandemic quite well. And there's more to authoritarianism than China. Autocracies like Russia and Iran are dealing with the pandemic quite poorly. But because China and the US are so influential, their examples will inevitably affect democracy's future. I don't want to dwell here on the reasons for America's struggles with the pandemic. You hear about those every day. I want to dive into the philosophical foundations of American democracy and pull out of those foundations 3 reasons for hope. Rational hope, hope based on intellectual substance. I want to look at the roots of America's political system and talk about why they give us a chance to succeed. Reason for hope number 1. The election coming up, November's election, is the first chance the American people have had to hire and fire representatives based on the pandemic. We've had elected representatives at the helm from the outset, but what changes in November is that for the first time, those representatives have to answer for the decisions they've made, and they answer to us. Remember, democracy doesn't just mean electing people to rule over us. It means after they govern for a little while, we get to decide if they keep their jobs. If we think our politicians blew it in response to this pandemic, November is our chance to say so. And if we think they handled the pandemic well, or that they're the right people to lead us back to productive life, November's election is our chance to say that too. Accountability at elections is the hallmark of democracy. Accountability means that when you think about democracy and the pandemic, you can't just look at the short term, and you've got to consider risk. Citizens in authoritarian countries have to live with their rulers' decisions even when those decisions spell disaster. When the rulers make good calls, things can go pretty well. But when they don't, the citizens are without recourse except revolution. That is a high-risk approach to politics. Citizens in democracies can change their leaders and their futures based on results. We have the capacity to change. That mitigates risk. It means we're at our best in the long run. And it means that even in the midst of this pandemic and economic crisis and racial crisis, we as a democratic people remain in control of our destiny. Reason for hope number 2. In true democracies, we don't just elect the people to do the deciding. We take up the policy issues of the day ourselves. We self-govern. True self-government is a dance with 3 steps. We deliberate as a people about matters of public concern. We form some majority convictions about what's right, a majority will. And we have the power to project that majority will into government such that state action reflects our convictions. Self-government is the of the people, by the people part of democracy. It is radical, and it is wonderful. And I want to acknowledge that in the United States in recent years, it doesn't seem to be working. Something about American public discourse has gone wrong, become partisan, polarized, bitter. And something about the connection between the American people and their government has gone wrong too, so that even when most Americans have made up their minds about something, too often they can't get the government to act accordingly. There's alienation within we the people, and alienation between the people and their government. But we have been through such periods of alienation before, and we've come through them because there is a deep wisdom built into the very structure of self-government. The policy issues ahead of us are difficult because they don't just involve questions of technical competence. They involve questions of how to balance competing values. Some Americans think we should do whatever is necessary to minimize the illness. Others think we should take on more medical risks to get the economy running again. Some think we should heed and abide by the policy views of medical professionals. Others think we should be more skeptical of experts. Some think we should centralize policy in the White House. Others think we should allow more state and local variation. These sorts of policy trade-offs are where self-government shines. Phase 1 of managing a pandemic might require massive quarantines. And you know what? It's not surprising authoritarian governments are good at that. Massive impositions of state power are what they do best. But phase 2 of managing a pandemic is about balancing competing goods. That's what democracies do best. Why? Partly because when we talk to each other, instead of just using power over each other, good arguments and good facts tend to prevail. Democratic deliberation is far from perfect, but it exerts a sort of pull, a tug toward the truth. And what's the alternative? Authoritarian governments routinely control their people with propaganda, secrets, coercion, and lies. Another reason self-government works is because when people truly self-govern, there is no ruling elite. There's dignity in that. We're not just passengers waiting to see what the people in charge decide to do. But also, ruling elites inevitably exhibit profound failures of judgment and goodwill. But when we self-govern, our values and our interests matter because we make them matter, because the people in charge are us. Finally, self-government works because at the end of the day, the American people have deep reservoirs of wisdom and good sense. Now, the process of self-government is messy. Take a deep breath, brace yourselves. You are guaranteed to hear views you strongly dislike. Maybe you're hearing some of them right now in this talk. But just remember, those disagreements are an essential part of a good thing. Democracies get to wisdom, but they get there slowly and they get there through contestation. Reason for hope number 3. American government is not a pure democracy, but a constitutional system with checks and balances, the rule of law, and individual rights. What constitutions do is structure the power of the state. The basic idea of the US Constitution is to give the state enough power to meet the needs of the moment while preventing surplus repression. So what we want from the Constitution in times of crisis is constrained strength. In a pandemic, we want to be able to ramp up executive power really high and then ramp it back down while keeping it always within a law-governed constitutional structure. We want a government with enough power to control contagion, but that still has to respect individual rights and individual variations of circumstance. And we want to preserve the constitutional system itself for when the crisis is over. We're seeing all of that. Imposing a quarantine at the scale we did is a remarkable demonstration of executive power. But the quarantine and bailout and other policies we've adopted have never been pure command and control. The White House, Congress, governors, state legislatures, and mayors all played a role. The courts remain open and are hearing claims of individual right. And a less formal part of the structure of checks and balances is working too. The businesses, churches, and other institutions that make up America's complex power structure are exercising some independent judgments. Above all, at the end of the day, the American people remain in control because if the last 228 years of unbroken 4-year election cycles are any clue, come November, the election will be held. Arguably, we're a bit too decentralized for a pandemic. The system is optimized more to prevent surplus repression than to enable unified action. But the system isn't broken, and we will emerge from this crisis with a constitution that preserves democratic freedom for tomorrow. So those are my 3 reasons for rational hope: accountability at elections, true self-government, and constrained strength in the Constitution. Things may seem dark now, but they need not stay that way. We are the world's oldest democracy, but democracy is evergreen because democracies can change. At the center of American democracy are the tools to meet this crisis and the larger crisis unvanquished, to go from doubt to confidence, from night to day, and from darkness back again to light.